Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. I am Ivy the Occultist, and today I am joined by Jasmyne Ambrosia, which I have been dying to get on my channel and to talk about vampirism in witchcraft. So, Jasmyne, welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're going to have all of her stuff linked below for anybody watching this video because she has some really interesting and mysterious stuff on her page. Whenever I want something that I've never heard of before, I always go to Jasmyne's page. And I'm like, ooh, what is that? I need to learn a little bit more. So, but today we're going to talk about vampiric magic, which is something that I have recently been diving deeper into and something I'm fairly new to. But I wanted to talk to Jasmyne about it because, Jasmyne, I believe you've been practicing this a little bit longer than I have. So I'm excited to have a discussion on it. But just to kind of start off with the most bare bones foundations, how would you define vampirism or vampiric magic? Like, what does that mean to you?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted at the fact that you think that my content is mysterious. Like, I love that, first of all. But vampirism, right, back to that. Um, you know, I am also a witch as well as a vampire. And both of these things for me are a noun. So it's who I am, but it's also an adjective, like it describes me, but it's also like a verb. It's what I do. I feel like witches are born and made. I feel like vampires can be born and made. But I also feel like vampirism and witchcraft is what we do in the sense of being a verb. Like you practice magic. You're not just a witch because it's who you are, it's also what you do. And I think that vampirism is very much the same way. And to me, like when it comes to what is vampirism in the craft, I think that it depends on how we're defining the word vampire and how we're kind of using that, because there's several different vampiric sort of sources. You have your fangdoms or your fans or your fandom vampires, your role players who like to incorporate literary or folkloric vampirism in their practice. You have your psi vamps who like to kind of pull energy into their practice. And then you have your sangs or your sanguines who work with blood in their practice. But I think that the core definition, going back to your question about vampirism, to me would be taking life force from one thing and pulling it into another. And I have some hot takes about that in regards to some of the questions that you sent me that I would love to touch on later on. But I think that my core definition would be taking life force from X, Y, or Z and bringing it into something.
Mm. I love how you said that. And I'm glad that you brought up the different types of people that identify as vampires too, because for me, I somewhat identify as a vampiric witch, but I don't think I could actually say I am a full blown vampire. Part of that is because I don't feel like I've earned that title yet because I'm so new to the culture. But there's so many different types. I mean, there are people out there that identify as vampires just as we identify as witches. And there's some vampires that really like to get into glamour magic as well. So there's that whole side of things. There's also the immortality philosophy that I was reading about, which is not necessarily like we are immortal in this vessel. It's more of like a philosophical approach to your essence being immortal. So I kind of
Right.
wanted to talk about that a little bit more too. And I wanted to ask you also, I've read about this concept of the dragon being part of vampiric magic as well. And I'm just curious, from my understanding, there is some sort of dragon within all of us, which is similar to like the holy guardian angel, which is something that was popularized by Aleister Crowley in the occult community. And I'm just curious, is that something that you've ever worked with? Have you even heard of this philosophy, or is that just like a specific group of vampires that work with the dragon?
It's definitely like a specific group,
Mm.
just like in witchcraft. There's many different sort of traditions within witchcraft, and vampires are literally no different. And also too, like there's a lot of overlap between our witches and our vampires. Like, don't think that there's not. So for those of you maybe watching this, if you've identified with the archetype of witch, I wouldn't say it would be uncommon for you to also identify with the archetype of vampire. But as far as the dragon goes, like basically the philosophy behind the dragon, you can take this in like a Luciferian Temple of Set sort of way, in the sense that the Temple of Set is a tradition of vampires and magical practitioners that basically broke off of Anton LaVey and like Luciferianism. And the dragon being Lucifer, or the other version is the dragon being like your primal instincts, which most people who are into the vampire lifestyle or religion or community kind of hold sacred this primal nature, of the, and you see this kind of like in the left hand path, right? Like sin or thirst, feeding isn't necessarily seen as a bad thing. And so the dragon kind of represents like our need for our primal nature to come out. And so you see that with like the lifestylers or the fangdoms, where they like to go out and party and get debaucherous and practice some hedonism with their vampirism. You see that with the Psy vamps, where they like to go out and feed on energy. That could look like ambient feeding, or surface feeding. So feeding on the aura of an individual, that would be more surface, but ambient would be like if we went to a concert or a football game and all that energy, right, is being put off by everyone enjoying the music or the game. Psy vamps feed on that too. So it just really depends in terms of like the dragon, but that's very a specific sect, I would say. Not all vampires are religious with their vampirism, but many are. So I think it's kind of a gray area, just like witchcraft, right? Is a witchcraft a religion? Is it a practice? You're going to get both answers in the occult world, right?
Yeah, definitely. I love that you touched on the blood aspect. That was something that I kind of wanted to clarify as well, because I think most people, and we're going to talk about some common misconceptions shortly, but I think most people think of vampirism being drinking blood or feeding off other people's blood, and not all vampires work with blood, as you said, and blood itself represents life force. And so sometimes it's not even physical blood, it's more of the essence of that person that you're working with, from what I'm understanding. It's similar to like prana in Sanskrit or chi in traditional Chinese culture. At least that's what I've been reading. So I was hoping that if you could clarify that a little bit, the relationship with blood specifically and what that means as a life force.
Well, blood is going to look different for different groups of vampires. Like there's different traditions, right? So a sanguine vampire, in general, we're not necessarily like feasting on blood. Like that's more of folklore and literature. Most sanguine vampires view blood to be a carrier for ka or prana or chi of life force. And most ethical sanguine vampires are going to have this exchange in a consensual way, because there's also this whole predator and prey sort of binary that the vampirism conversation inherently brings up, right? So for sanguine vampires, it's the carrier for life force. And typically we would do this by lancet, like in a clean, sterile way. Honey, we're vampires in 2023 now. I almost said 2022. It's going to take some time to get used to that. But we use lancets. We don't use like our actual fangs. And it's done consensually and ceremonially and ritualistically. And sanguine vamps, we view blood as a carrier for life force. But like Psy vamps, we would not view it in the same way. Psy vamps don't require any blood, because that's not a part of the Psy vampirism practice, because we're feasting on the energy of life force. So that can come from the auric field as opposed to blood in a literal sense, right?
Yes.
So if you're asking how blood kind of plays a part in vampirism, it would depend on what kind of vampire you would be talking to. I personally identify as a bit of a hybrid. I started off in my vampiric practice just always being drawn to blood. It was in a way a bit of like an attraction, but not so much like in a sexual way. I remember being about like 12 and like cutting my finger, I think on like some paper or something, like a paper cut, and like sucking the blood, right? Like I just felt called to like lap it up. And it tasted kind of like iron or like what I would imagine like pennies would taste like. And then that kind of took me from there in some ways. In terms of the psi vampirism for me, my entire life I've been told that I'm too much. My entire life I've been told that my energy consumes the entire room that I'm in. Not to sound like a raging narcissist or anything, but
Not at all.
that's what I've been told. Oh, she talks too much. Or, oh, her energy is like really heavy. Or, you know, stuff like that, right? My entire life. And so the psi vampirism bit, I think, kind of comes from I am extremely independent, but I'm also very extroverted. And I feed off of social interaction, like what we're doing right now. I was like, oh, honey, I can eat later. Like,
No, I love that you say that. And I want to go deeper into your journey as well and how you got to vampirism, because I'm really interested to know what, almost for my own selfish gains, I want to know how you got there, because I feel like I'm in that right now, in that phase. So, but before we get into that, let's talk about some of the common misconceptions, because I think one of the biggest things that people think about when they hear vampirism or the word vampire, well, they either think of the literary term of the vampire that's immortal, that sparkles in the sunlight, that, you know, I mean, Twilight, whatever. They think of
well,
that.
there's different literaries, right? Like there's
Oh,
your
yeah.
Twilight vampire, but there's also like Anne Rice,
Yes.
iconic, that
Mm.
homoerotic vampire. There's also Brahms, Dracula,
Yes.
iconic. Like there's different literary sources. How about the Vampire Masquerade? Like
Ooh.
there's different sort of sources.
Mm-hmm.
So even in literature, the vampire has not always been the same archetype. However, almost every single culture around the world has had some sort of archetype of the vampire from their own geography.
Yes.
Um,
Yes, I agree. Yeah, there's either the literary or the, and by the way, I love Anne Rice. Oh, so iconic. But either that or they're thinking of the energy vampire out in the world that is just draining you, that maybe doesn't even know they're a vampire. They just suck the life out of you whenever you're around them. And I think that vampirism gets a really bad reputation because everybody assumes that all vampirism is non-consensual, and that's not true. Some of it is consensual. So I was hoping that maybe you could talk about, well, we can both talk about some of those common misconceptions.
well, I think, like you said, that's a big misconception playing into the whole like predator and prey is that vampires are predators of a physical or sexual nature. I think that that can be true for some. Like there's messed up people in every community, right?
Yes.
Like there's also very toxic, problematic witches, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. There's very toxic, problematic nurses who abuse their license to harm people or to discriminate against who they take care of,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So I think that's a misconception that vampirism equals um, predator or abuser is not correct, in my opinion. Another big misconception, and I know that the New Age community will love this, but in my opinion, being an energy vampire and an empath are two sides of the same coin.
Ooh, I so agree. Tell me more. I agree.
So, empaths, what is an empath to you? Like, how would you define an empath?
Ooh, off the top of my head, okay, I would say it's somebody that absorbs the emotions of everyone around them, which to me is vampiric. So,
Exactly.
yes.
So, a lot of these empaths who are sick and who are miserable and who are feeling depressed and downtrodden because they're empaths and they're absorbing all this energy around them.
Yes. I mean, but for real, that was actually my entryway into vampirism because I identify as unfortunately a hardcore empath. And I say unfortunately because it's really hard to shield myself. And that's it. That's it right there. You're absorbing the energies of everyone around you. And sometimes it's unconscious behavior, but I don't think empaths want to be called vampires because maybe they don't understand the philosophy.
So, no, they don't. And I feel like they don't because the powers that be within the craft, the occult, first of all, witchcraft, we have had our talons clipped, our wings clipped, our fangs shaved down. Witchcraft has been made palatable.
Mm,
That's a big problem.
mm,
Um, and in terms of like energy work with empaths and vampires, we've been made to feel like these are a binary that are polarities when in fact, actually, it's really the same thing. So if you are someone who is an empath, you are absorbing ka, you are absorbing prana, you are absorbing chi. Honey, you're a vampire. There's no other way to say that. And I know that a lot of empaths, and especially people from a more new age background, have been taught to fear the energy vampire, right?
mhm.
There's even memes all over Facebook of like the psi vampire or the energy vampire. Beware, because like they prey on the empath, but the empath is the energy vampire. Like that whole narrative to me is a falsehood, um, and keeps energy vampires in a state of receiving in a way that they don't even know what they're doing.
Mm. Yeah, I think there's a scale of healed and unhealed, and maybe the closer you are to unhealed, the more you're going to really unconsciously take people's energy away without thinking about it. I know for myself, I was a massage therapist for a really long time, and when I would work on people, without even knowing it, I would work on somebody for neck pain or back pain or whatever, and I would fix their problem, but then the next day I had neck pain or I had back pain or whatever it was that I was working on them, I had absorbed their
But that's
pain.
vampiric.
Exactly. It is. Absolutely. So, yeah, I think people don't realize, I think people are maybe misconstruing vampirism with narcissism, and that's not the case because they're assuming these energy vampires that are just sucking the life out of you and exhausting you and all these things. I think that's just more of a narcissistic person, and it's really draining to be around them, not necessarily that they are a true vampire or whatever. Because I agree with you. I think the empaths, the ones that are trying to heal people, really are vampiric, but that's a good thing because they can use that for good potentially.
Well, I think that, so I personally identify as a bit of a hybrid,
Mhm.
in terms like, so can I talk about a little bit of the different like vampire traditions?
Absolutely, go for it.
So your sangs or your sanguines are very much in line with literally consuming like blood, right? Your psi vamps are more in line with consuming the energy of life force from the aura. You have like your lifestylers who like aren't so much into like consuming, but like they like to dress the part. We have the same thing in the craft, right? Like
Yeah,
we have the same kind of people who they love to go to like the witches' balls, but like they're not actually at a Sabbat or an Esbat ever.
right.
Like, right. And then you have like hybrids that are kind of like a mix of sanguine or psi. Um, for me personally, there is also like this idea that like sanguine vampires are going to like bite your throat and lap at your neck blood like a vampire bat, right?
Okay.
Like when people hear blood drinker, is that not what you think?
That is exactly what people think. Yes.
Normally, in spaces I've been in, because I am a part of several vampiric orders, I've never seen that from another sanguine where someone gets literally bitten into and
Mm,
drunk. I've never seen that. I've
mm,
never seen that. I'm not saying that that's like not done, right? Because I'm not everywhere all of the time. Um, Maybe, but I've never seen that. Most blood drinkers are doing it through a lancet, and someone is literally like pricking their finger and putting that blood into like some wine for someone to consume. being a sanguine does kind of mean like you're consuming blood. And I feel like that sort of experience is something that I can't even put into words.
Mm.
Because it's an experience that, like, unless you have experienced it, I don't think you can really explain it. So I don't know how like comfortable you are with talking about like some OTO or some Thelema stuff, but like the cakes of light are made by menstrual blood and semen and
Oh, I
are
didn't know that.
baked.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
so they're baked. So you make like some dough of bread and
Mhm.
you add menstrual blood or semen to it, and then you make a loaf of bread, and then you burn the loaf of bread down to an ash, and then you take a pinch of that ash and bake it into a dough, and then you make it into little cookies. So you're not, it's very safe, but it's a very taboo thing in a
Right.
way. um, I've seen that sort of Thelema aspect also woven into the sanguine culture, where someone will prick their finger and bleed into a batter of cookie dough, and then those
Mhm.
cookies are cooked and then consumed by the colony or the coven, because vampires also use the term coven for their groups as well. Um, I'm rambling. I'm sorry. What was the
No,
question?
I'm loving this. I don't even know what question we're on now. Oh, I do now. But no, I am loving this ramble so far. And I totally agree with what you said about vampires not necessarily drinking blood from the neck, because I think most vampires, as you said, we're in 2023. It's toxic to drink blood excessively. It's not good for you to be drinking blood. So it would be like a finger prick or just a little drop of blood here and there in your ritual in a ceremonial way. And in most cases, it is consensual. And that was the point that I really wanted to make with this video, is that I feel like so many people think it's non-consensual when that's really not the case for a lot of people doing vampirism. It is consensual. And so with that, let's I kind of wanted to talk about our personal practices a little bit more so people can get an idea of what vampiric magic actually looks like. But let's go back to you and how you got down this path and where you are now. And I know you mentioned that you were kind of obsessed with blood from 12 years old, but what happened after that point that led you here?
So yeah, so I identify as a hybrid, so a bit of a Psy and Sang vampire. Um, I've always had an attraction to blood. It's an attraction, like, period. I can't quite put it into words, really. But as far as like how I got on the path of like calling myself a vampire was very much actually from like the New Age community,
Mm.
because that's when I first heard of like vampirism as like a spiritual tea, in the sense that like there were empaths and there were vampires, right? So rewinding, growing up, my father's side of my family is quite secular, so non-religious. My mother's side of my family is more like what we would call like a Sufi, or like a spiritual Islamic background. Got your Shias and your Sunnis, but the Sufis are still pretty Islamic, though most castes of Muslims wouldn't consider Sufi a branch of that because of how much esotericism is woven into the belief system. And like in ancient Samaria, the Lalitu were literally vampires,
Mm.
literally vampires. Lilith, the goddess, the first vampire, that kind of like intrigued me from like a mythology standpoint, because I was like, okay, so this is a tea. And then when I was 19, I started working at a metaphysical store in my local area, just as like a retailer, like cashier. And then I kind of worked my way up to like reading angel cards, which I don't even do that anymore. But I had to take some like classes and courses at the store to be able to read. And a lot of people were talking about like these energy vampires. And I was like, ooh, I think that's me. Um, and so as a fan of like Anne Rice and like Brahms Dracula, and then like hearing this in my sort of chosen spiritual community, I was like, okay, maybe this is a tea. And so I started exploring it further, and that led me to like the cults of Isis and like ancient Egypt. Um, and Isis being like the first vampire.
Mm.
And like the Sumerian Lilith, the Lilitu, being like the first vampire. And then I realized there was like a whole religious aspect to vampirism that I hadn't realized before. So I started to explore that further, and it gave me a lot of validation and knowing that like I'm not a scourge on humanity as an energy vampire, because I think witches particularly have really caused a lot of problems for the vampiric community. Um, in the sense that like energy vampires are literally shunned in a lot of ways, are they not?
They are. Yeah. Nobody wants an energy vampire. You're not wrong.
And all of these witches fear energy vampire. Like,
Yes.
don't have one amongst you. Like,
Yes.
they're a drain, they're a hassle, they're a burden, they're narcissistic. It's a synonym.
Yes.
And so it's been a wild ride, kind of walking between the worlds of witch and vampire. But there is also a vampiric path that involves like most side vamps and most like spiritual vampires involve witchcraft or some sense of religion in their vampiric practice.
Mm. Yeah, I think I do. From what I've read and heard from people who have practiced for a while, there is a lot of energy work involved, and there's almost always some sort of witchcraft mixed in there somewhere. I mean, it's just energy work, right? And witches do energy work, vampires do energy work, and so there's a lot of crossover. And I resonate so much with something that you said earlier too, because for me, I have always been obsessed with blood as well, and I could never put my finger on why. And especially because now as I have two majors right now that I'm going to school for, and one of my majors is molecular bio, and I'm obsessed with biology and the amount of information that we don't have yet on blood and how important it is to the body is, I mean, you would be so surprised how little we know about blood. It's such a spiritual concept, and it's not like I was obsessed with blood to the point where I was like cutting myself every day or something like that. It was more of like a spiritual experience. I really viewed blood as this spiritual essence that flows in all of us. And I mean, if you go back in history and look at blood sacrifices, not that I'm condoning blood sacrifices by any means, but blood was seen as such a spiritual thing in so many pagan cultures across time and space. And it's fascinating. So I think that's where I got drawn into vampirism a little bit. Then I had an obsession with vampires. I mean, obsession with Anne Rice. And then of course I went down the Twilight route because whatever. I'm ashamed to say it, but there were good books. The movies were terrible, but the books were great. And so I loved seeing vampires on screen. I loved acting and pretending I was a vampire every single year for Halloween. And I never thought that it was an actual spiritual path that somebody could take until just in the past 2 years. And then the past year in particular, it's really kind of piqued my interest again. And I've started going down that path. And you don't even realize, like you said, as an empath, you really are absorbing all the energies of the people around you. And it can be extremely draining. And I love how you said there's something else. I'm kind of tangenting here for a second, but I promise I'll get there. There's something else that you said that I thought was really interesting, how you are an extrovert and you gain energy by being in social interactions and being around the people, you know, whatever people it is. For me, I feel the exact opposite. I am a hardcore 99% introvert, and I am so drained by any social interaction. Even if I enjoy it, even if I like being around those people, it's beyond draining for me. And so I'm wondering, are there two different kinds of vampiric? How does it give energy to some person, but then it takes energy from another person, but both people are vampiric in that moment? You know what I mean? Then I'm wondering if there's
Well,
like two
I
sides.
think it depends on how you feed. And I know that
Mm,
feeding, I don't want the vampires to come for me because I know that feeding is often like a word that we don't use. It's not super PC anymore. We use like harvesting or gathering are
mm,
the words that
okay.
you're supposed to use. So it depends on how you harvest energy. Um, I think that makes the difference in like the extroverted or introverted vampire.
Mhm.
Psi vamps specifically are harvesting energy from someone's aura or from an ambient source. So, like a concert,
And that's something that I
or
do.
feeding on someone personally. Like, there's vampiric techniques to um, harvest on someone personally. I sent you some books like by Michelle Belanger that talk about visual techniques, about like visualizing like tentacles reaching over someone, like, and like the hooks, and like there's different like visualization techniques to like harvest energy from an individual. But
I
as
mean,
far as like introvert and extrovert, I mean,
I don't know either. I don't have the answer. I just thought that was really interesting. Maybe I haven't found the way that I need to feed yet or something. Maybe that's what it
or
is.
maybe it's who you're feeding on or where you're feeding.
Mm.
Like, where do you find yourself feeding? So let me ask you this. Do you identify as a psi vampire?
I don't know. I don't know. So the ambient, yes, absolutely. I will go to a concert and absorb all of those energies and feed it into my amulets and talismans. And that's something I was doing before I even knew vampirism or vampiric magic was a thing. I would take my items to a concert to charge them, and I'd visualize, rather than the tentacles, I do the tendril technique, which is where you visualize these tendrils sprouting off of your body and then
Yes.
kind of grabbing that energy, sucking it in, and then fueling it through your talisman or whatever. And so that's typically what I've done in the past, is in like crowded spaces or like riots or parties or somewhere where there's just a lot of extra energy that you can skim off the top. But when I'm, having to converse with people, maybe this is a whole separate thing. Maybe it's me just talking to people that's draining for me because I don't like talking, surprisingly. I don't know.
Or could you be maybe harvesting energy without realizing it? And you're allowing their energy to become one with yours because
Mm.
there's not a differentiation between interaction and feeding. Like that
Mm.
could be a thing too. And I think that's what a lot of empaths sometimes empaths are vampires to me. Like, so I use the words like interchangeably. Um, but yeah, and also in terms of like ambient feeding, that's so important, I think, for witches to tap into. As a witch myself, you can do the work in your own name. You can do the magic in your own name, and that's very powerful. And you should do that, but you shouldn't always do that, in my opinion. And in the solar court, like, you either take energy from place, as in like taking it from the land, the earth itself, sacred spaces out in nature, or you take it from a person
Mm.
and you pull that magic towards you and you work that magic in your spell. If you're
Mm.
always working this magic and pulling the arcana from your ka, from your soul, that's how you get fucked up.
Okay. So maybe I've just been doing it wrong this whole time. And if I were to get better at it, then I wouldn't be so drained after every single interaction.
Maybe
Possible.
try it.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not here to say anyone is doing it the wrong way. That's
I
not what I
mean,
want to say, but
no,
like an
of course not.
alternative way.
Yes. Yes. Interesting. Okay. Well, let's talk about our personal techniques. Let's talk about vampiric magic in the sense of what does it look like for you? Like, what techniques do you like to do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis? Just give us a snapshot of what that looks like.
So nightclubs, love it for ambient feeding. Like, nightclubs are great for ambient feeding because you can literally just like go out into the dance floor and harvest the energy that's already there. Like, it's already there. And like you mentioned, like putting that into an amulet and using that later, or a crystal and using that later, in a working or in a crystal grid, or charging or consecrating a ritual tool that's in your purse at a concert with all of the energy that is raised, especially if the musician has like some occult or magical lyrics in there and like people are chanting that, like that's powerful, right?
Yes.
In terms of blood, in ATW, blood from a witch's standpoint is viewed as a tool. And so we bleed onto our tools as a way to empower them and anoint them and connect them to us.
Mm.
So your Boline, your Shelg, your Athame, your witch cord, your Stang, all of those things would be bled upon to anoint it, because We are where the magic comes from in our belief system. We are where the magic comes from. The ritual tool itself, that athame, that stang, is a tool. We give it the magic. It's not inherently magical. And we give it the magic by feeding it with blood. How do you incorporate vampirism in your practice?
So definitely how you said with concerts. I don't go to nightclubs, not because now I'm too much of an introvert. I don't enjoy going out and being around humans. But um, I would say I did a video about energy hubs, and I kind of talked about it in there a little bit. So if anybody's watched that video, this might be a little bit redundant. But I had gone to a High Lung concert, and High Lung is amazing. I mean, their concerts are like full-blown rituals. They're doing
Yes.
smoke cleansing. Oh, so good. And when people are chanting in the audience and everybody's raising energy together, there's so much energy at a concert that you can skim energy off the top and everyone will still be left with plenty. You know, you're not really depleting anybody in that way. And
And it's
so,
not really a
yeah,
consensual matter either, because
right,
everyone is exerting that energy. Like
right.
it's free energy,
It
witches.
is.
Take it.
It is free energy. I so agree. And with the consensual vampirism, I actually do this with my partner, and I was doing it with them before I even knew it was any sort of vampiric magic. But I get anxiety quite frequently, and they don't. They are probably the healthiest human being that I've ever met in my entire life, and they willingly, consensually give me their energy. And so, what I found in doing this process consensually is that they are able to stabilize my emotions and make me feel a lot more calm, a lot more safe. And it's literally just us sitting down together and touching, I mean, hand to hand or hand to arm or whatever. And I am visualizing my tendrils soaking up their energy into my body. And it feels amazing. And that cures my potential panic attack in the moment. And so that to me is vampiric magic. And that's also consensual. So I feel like everybody could practice something like that. And I also feel like most people do that without even realizing that they're doing that.
Mhm.
You know, they're just like grabbing onto somebody because they need some stability in the moment, and they're not realizing that they're taking a little bit of that person's energy to help stabilize them. And that's not a
Right.
bad thing, you know?
Right.
So I would say that. I would say in a coven scenario, I see a little bit of vampiric magic as well. Now check me on this because I'm curious to know your thoughts, because you and I are both in covens. When you're doing group ritual and you have one person that's leading the ritual, whatever that person's title is, everyone else is willingly kind of giving up some of their energy to the person directing it. And then the person directing it is pushing that energy towards the goal of the group. And so for me, I feel like that's almost a little bit vampiric because the person directing it is in control in that moment. They're taking the energies and putting it together towards the common goal. Would you consider that vampiric? I'm just curious.
I would.
Okay. So any sort of group work that involves that. Yeah, I was thinking about that and I was like, wow, that is very vampiric. But so with covens, and then the last way that I feel like I personally incorporate some vampiric magic is through glamour magic. So I don't know how deep this goes in the vampire community, so maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here too, but I feel like glamours are so integral to vampiric magic because you can really make yourself appear however you want to. And I have gotten really, really skilled at making myself invisible. And I just want to fly right under the radar. Nobody notices I'm there. I can hear things that they don't realize I'm hearing. Invisibility is one of my specialties. That is my favorite glamour. I love being invisible. So I don't know if you work with glamours or not, but I'd love to hear about your experience with that if you do.
I mean, as a trans woman, I think that I am the epitome of glamour magic, like
That is the
for
damn truth.
survival,
Well, yes.
period.
Hmm.
Like for survival.
Yeah. I never even thought about that. You are absolutely correct. That's it. That's your whole glamour.
If we're talking about like literally glamour magic, but
Mm,
there's also like spiritual glamour magic to like make lead appear like gold, right? Or like to get that job interview or to influence that person. Those are glamours too. Um, and there's ways to go about doing so. Like you can take the energy from an event and put it into an amulet and wear it to your interview to
mhm.
influence that person. Like that's another way. But yeah,
Yes.
glamour, we wrote the book, baby. We wrote the book.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I love that answer. So let's talk a little bit more about the societies that you're a part of. I don't know how much you can say. I don't know what you're at liberty. You know, some societies like to keep things secret. So whatever you can share, what groups are you a part of? How'd you get into them? What's your experience? Basically, tell me literally everything you want to.
So I will change some names to keep things fourth power. But yeah, we have like a vampire club, like in our city that like hosts monthly like get-togethers. And I've been very fortunate to be a part of it. And there's also another club that you have to like initiate into in our city that has been going on actually since like the 60s. So
Oh.
yeah, I've been adjacent to that one. But nightclubs and Psy vampirism and even some Sang vampirism and nightclubs, like they do go hand in hand. That's how I have kind of been introduced to some of these groups. Our coven, the SCC, um, we're also all vampires, and we also use vampiric magic as an inherent core of our coven practice.
Mm.
And so I've been very fortunate to, I won't say make people vampires, because like being a witch, you're born and made, but I've made a couple of vampires. So that's cool.
Okay, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Okay, so what is the process? What does that mean? How do you do that? Or you can't give away the secrets.
Well, I will say that like vampiric magic, we've talked about what that looks like. Like you're pulling energy. And I
Mhm.
think that it's imperative to know how to do that. That way, you're not using your own energy for your magic. Because if you can take energy from the land or another person, you don't have to deplete your own ka. You don't have to deplete your own life source. And there's other spiritual traditions that do this as well, like the Temple of Set or um, the sect of Akaset, which is Isis prior name. Like Isis is a Greek name for Isis.
Mm.
She's also seen as like a matron of vampires. There's a whole Kemetic Egyptian group that venerates her
Wow.
and pulls magic from her.
Wow.
Um, there's also like the Black Veil vampires, which are like a group that you can join from the comfort of your own home through Father Sebastian.
Yes, I did read his book. That was the one that I just finished. That's got to be, is that the biggest vampire group out there? Or are there some others that are larger? It seems like
I
it's the
will say
biggest
it's the
one.
most marketed and well known.
Okay,
I will
that's
say
what it
that
is.
Father Sebastian is kind of the Wicca of the vampire community.
That's what I was feeling. Okay, got it.
So, but yeah, like those are important skills, I think, for a witch to have, even if you don't identify as a vampire. You shouldn't be using your own energy to manifest the astral into the physical
Mm.
all the time. I think you'll become sick and I think you'll become decrepit very quickly if you do that.
1000% agree. I am always telling people, especially, I mean, quick magic. Yeah, I've used my own energy and it's not a big deal. But if you're going to do a spell to like change your life, you're going to do something big, you need to start tapping into other energy sources. You cannot do that on your energy alone. Maybe you can, but you'll probably feel like shit afterwards. I mean, I always do. If I'm not grounding, if I'm not pulling from somewhere else, then it's not going to be good for you. So I agree with that. So, how long have you been in these organizations? So have you, I'm trying
I
to
can't give
pry.
specifics.
I know.
I
I'm
can't
trying
give
to pry.
specifics for your stream. I'm
Mm.
sorry.
No, no, it's
Um,
totally fine. I
but
respect that.
I have been affiliated with, we'll call it like the Equator Club. We can talk more off air.
Okay.
I will
That sounds
absolutely divulge some secrets off air. But the Equator Club is affiliated like with a nightclub, and like you can get in tune with that. I have been a member of this club for 3 years.
Oh, that's a long time. Wow. Yeah, I was trying to pry without like prying too much. So I respect that. You're in awesome groups and we'll just leave it at that. And then you and I can talk off air. Sorry, everybody. um,
But there are also groups that you can tap into. And I'm
yes.
sure if you do some spells to open some doors and, open the way to that current, there's magic that you can tap into to connect with similar like-minded people. There's this wise proverb that like a wolf that never howls will never find its pack. If you're not reaching out to your community to connect to it, you're never going to find it. And even if I did name the names of these groups, like, are you in Indianapolis, Indiana? Probably
Probably not.
not.
Yeah.
So what good would that do you?
Right.
Also, I'm
Right.
not allowed to, but that's part of being like literally in like a secret society is that we don't sit up here and be like, oh, it's this and it's that and it's this and it's that.
That is one thing about the vampiric community that I really, really respect, because I have been trying to find that information for myself of some other people to connect with that do this type of magic, that are interested in this lifestyle. And it's so secretive. I mean, you try to look up witchcraft and witchcraft's everywhere. I mean, witches are all over the place getting together, but you try to look up vampires or a vampiric anything, nothing. It's so hidden. So yeah, I I agree with you. I
Well,
think
it
they do a
has
good
to
job.
be. It has to be in a way
Mm,
because it's so misunderstood and so misinterpreted.
yeah.
And there's literally been a hunt for it. Like, so some of these sacred rites and rituals, speaking more so from like a spiritual vampiric, side, like as a devotee of Lilith, a priestess of Lilith, also a queen of vampires, much like Isis. Um, some of our stuff like is not fit for the general consumption. That's why you're not going to find books about it. That's why you're not going to find people out there with blogs about it. And even within witchcraft, like you'll find a lot of Wicca books, sure. You'll find a lot of folk magic books, sure. But I have an unpopular opinion in the sense that initiatory witchcraft is closed.
Mm.
It actually is closed. Even Wicca technically is a closed practice. You're going to find books about it, but you're not going to learn the inner mysteries of a second or third degree within Gardnerianism.
Mhm.
No.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that you need to be initiated in, obviously. And if you're not initiated, then it is closed to you. And that's not saying that you can't potentially apply for it, but to say
And
that you're
that's not saying that
practicing
you
it.
can't practice folk magic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something.
Absolutely, you can. And chaos magic. Like I loved, you did a couple of videos with someone, I forget their name, but you did a
Oh,
video on their channel and then on your channel. That
yes.
was some good chaos magic content.
Yeah, Sonray's awesome. I was glad to have those conversations with him for sure. Yeah, chaos magic is absolutely open, and I am always okay to talk about that. So if anybody wants to be a chaos magician, I'm just saying, come to my side. But let's talk about some, just to kind of wrap up here, because I want to keep talking to you about this forever. But let's talk about maybe some resources. You had recommended me some books, so I'm going to put those in the description box for anybody that's interested in going deeper down this path. But just off the top of your head, are there any resources that you can think of? I can't remember what those books were that you had recommended.
So definitely like check out the books, but also like just get into the vampirism. I think that the books are great. Um, there's a vampire book, like Vampire with a Y, that I sent you.
Mhm.
That's a really good book on like sort of just the general sense of vampirism, and energy vampirism is often spelt with a Y. So a lot of literature that's vampire with a Y will be more energy or lifestyle vampires. Father Sebastian's Black Veil is like a very popular, very kind of seen as like the gold star for vampirism in the mainstream. But really, like the path of the vampire is not mainstream, even within occult societies. And I think the best way for you to get a better understanding of the vampire is for you to explore how you harvest or how you feed. And I think that's enough to say.
I love that. Thank you so much, Jasmine. This conversation has been so enlightening for me, and I hope that it helps other people understand vampiric magic a little bit better. And I just don't want it to be seen or portrayed in a negative light anymore. So thank you for having this conversation with me, even though it's kind of a secretive topic, a taboo topic, but I'm glad that we could chat today. So
Thank you for having me.
oh, yes, of course. Thank you for coming on the channel, and I will see you all in another video soon. Bye.